The following program is presented as a public service by the Patrick Butler Family Foundation.
But she is not dead, though in her tomb she lies helpless and motionless. Still on her lips is the spirit of life, and on her cheeks the glow of beauty.
KTCA-TV, St. Paul, Minneapolis, presents Ireland Rediscovered, a series of 13 programs dealing with the significance of the Irish nation, which has emerged to statehood in our own times. Dr. John McKiernan, head of the Department of English at the College of St. Thomas in St. Paul and an authority on Ireland, is host and lecturer. The title of this program is To Hell or Connaught. Here again is Professor McKiernan.
We concluded our last lecture with the harrowing tale of Elizabethan Ireland, an Ireland that suffered defeat after defeat. Although in the last years of that century, the great leaders O'Donnell and O'Neill had almost wrested the freedom of their country once more from the English. However, it was not to be. And although Spanish help had come in 1601 and had landed at the southern town of Kinsale, their help was of little avail, because the Irish had to march, the Irish armies of O'Neill and O'Donnell had to march the whole length of Ireland to meet the Spaniards in the little town of Kinsale in the south of Ireland. Had they come almost any other place, success might have attended the efforts of the combined armies. But as it was, the Battle of Kinsale was an inglorious disaster for Ireland. That battle, that name, the Battle of Kinsale, will always be a sorrowful memory for Ireland. For there, the Gaelic nation was lost, the historic nation with a pedigree of 2,000 years. How many European nations could boast of such a pedigree? But the Battle of Kinsale was the ruination of Ireland's hopes. There, all was lost. The dice were thrown, and all was gone. What then would follow? The leaders of the country had fled, or were soon to flee. Thousands of soldiers were dead. The people were completely cowed. What would be the next move? James I succeeded Elizabeth in England, and James I knew his Machiavelli. Machiavelli had some advice to offer the ruler. In The Prince, Machiavelli has this to say: "A prince does not spend much on colonies. Therefore, colonize thine enemy. A prince does not spend much on colonies, for with little or no expense he can send them out and keep them there, and he offends only the minority of the citizens, from whom he takes lands and houses to give them to the new inhabitants." This was to be the new policy of England, a policy with great success as far as England was concerned. The 17th century then, in Irish history, is the century of what is called the plantations, for the colonies that were sent out from England and Scotland were planted. They were under the supervision of people who were called undertakers. That is because they undertook to colonize a stipulated tract of country in Ireland. The plantations naturally were resented by the Irish, and we know that by 1641, barely the midpoint of the century, less than 50% of the country was now in the hands of Irish Catholics. We'll mention in a moment the significance of the religious indication. But by the mid-century, or slightly before the mid-century, less than 50% of Ireland was left in the hands of Irish Catholics. And within a dozen years after that, in other words, barely beyond the midpoint of the 17th century, only 10% of the land of Ireland was now in the hands of Irish Catholics. A most remarkable, a most thorough, a most disastrous colonization of the country, insofar as the native Irish were concerned. But as Machiavelli suggests, you offend certainly not those to whom you give the lands, but you offend only those from whom you take them away. And if they are helpless, as Machiavelli pointed out, they can do no harm to the prince. So that colonization is something then which may be a successful plan for an ambitious king. This is the history of Ireland for a great part of the 17th century. I mentioned that the Catholic Irish were despoiled of their lands. It was the lands of the Catholics which were confiscated. And now I must remind you all that England had undergone a reformation, so that by the 17th century, while she might not have been solidly Protestant, she was at least safely Protestant. There was no question about the fact that Protestantism was there to stay. In Ireland, the obverse was true. Ireland might not be safely Catholic, but she was solidly Catholic. And this most unfortunate tying together now of religion and politics, which has been unfortunate wherever it has occurred in the history of man, but which was to have such unhappy consequences for Ireland, this can be traced to the late 16th and particularly to the 17th century in Ireland. For every attempt was made now by England to identify loyalty to the crown with loyalty to Protestantism, so that even the early English settlers, or at least the earlier English settlers, who happened to be Catholic, were now regarded as disloyal unless they were also Protestant. A new element now entered into the relationships between the countries, because there was something of the fervor of a crusade. Ireland was not only to be grappled to the crown, but Ireland was also to be converted to Protestantism, or the papists were to be rooted out, one or the other. You can imagine then the opportunity to the adventurer type, the man who perhaps cared little enough about religion, but saw a magnificent opportunity to combine a religious crusade with an economic opportunity. This was the great misfortune of the 17th century. Slightly before the midpoint, by 1641, the temper of the Irish, whose lands now had been expropriated for over a generation, the temper of the Irish snapped. And in 1641, there was another rebellion against English rule. The old Gaels, the old nation, and some of the Anglo-Irish combined. And a great leader came from the continent, came from the lowlands, where he had been in service with the Spanish army, an O'Neill, the right man with the right name, a man whose exploits on the continent had rung far and wide there, a man whose military genius was well recognized, and a man who had the name. Owen Roe O'Neill came to lead the Irish in that rebellion of 1641. Well, now, things were in a very complex state of affairs in England. England was rushing into civil war. There was trouble between the king and Parliament at this time, so that England's attention in Ireland was somewhat distracted, and on the other hand, her attention was focused upon Ireland, not only because of the rebellion, but because Certainly in the 17th century and in the 16th century, in a way even more so than in previous centuries, Ireland had been the means of supplying England with a great deal of money through confiscation, booty, plunder, and so on. And both parties in England, both the royalists and the parliamentarians, whose differences of opinion were rapidly moving them to civil war, both of them looked to Ireland to supply, to draw from Ireland the supply of money needed for them to prosecute their campaigns. Well, meanwhile, the war moved on in Ireland. O'Neill was the best man in the field, and when he himself was in command, he won many important victories over the English. But hardly any of the other Irish leaders were of his caliber, and he couldn't be everywhere at once. Nonetheless, he might have left a great name, a greater name in Ireland. He might have brought a great deal, he might have brought the whole of success in his train, except for the fact that in 1649 he died. And in the same year, Cromwell arrived in Ireland. Cromwell had won in England. The Civil War had gone to the parliamentarians. Cromwell was the victor in England, and he intended to be the victor in Ireland. One of his first campaigns, or one of his first moves, was against the city of Drogheda, slightly north of Dublin. And here, after a glorious surrender by the garrison, which was chiefly an English garrison, by the way, that is, the English-Irish, he slaughtered 3,000 in a massacre that lasted over 3 days. This was an extraordinarily cruel time in Irish history, and the name of Cromwell registered immediately with a shock upon the sense of the country. This was not all that gave Cromwell's name all the terror of the Hitlerian name in our time. This was indeed a true Schrecklichkeit. This was indeed a war of terror, and something that appalled the Irish. Cromwell moved rapidly against several other cities, and eventually, although he left Ireland before his commanders did, eventually the Cromwellian armies were successful. But one of the other terrible things, as far as Ireland goes, that Cromwell's armies did, under his authority, was to round up thousands of Irish men and women, particularly younger women, and to sell these people as slaves to the planters in the West Indies and in the Barbados. Thousands of Irish youth, young men and young women, were thus sold as slaves, and from them has arisen a mixed breed, if you will, of people in the South, of Negroes who have a legitimate title to Irish names, of Rileys and Murphys and other Irish names associated now with the Negro people. A rather horrible time in Irish history that these young should have been ripped out of their country, but possibly if they had remained, they might have had at least as bad a fate. The statistician, the English statistician, Petty by name, and one of the founders of the Royal Society, a mathematician of quite some repute in England, calculated that by the middle of the 17th century, and within a period of only 10 years, the Irish population had been reduced 50%. This, then, is a picture of the grimness of that century. Later in the century, there were two events which we should note in our rapid survey, again associated with English politics. One could hardly think, in retrospect, of course retrospect overlooks the complexities of the contemporary scene, but one could hardly think that the Irish could be brought to fight on behalf of an English king. But this is exactly what happened toward the end of the century. When James II was deposed in England, he looked to Ireland for help to restore him to the throne. The Gaels of Scotland rallied to his cause, and the Gaels of Ireland, or at least such of them as could, rallied to his cause. And in a battle at the Boyne River, they were defeated. The armies of James were defeated. James earning for himself a very uncomplimentary name, which might be a bit too vulgar to tell you today, but earning for himself a very uncomplimentary name by his cowardice. James fled to Dublin, and when he arrived there, complained to Lady Tyrconnell, "The Irish have left the field, they ran away." And she very archly observed, "I see your Majesty has won the race." The first event then to mention is the deposition of James, the fact that the Irish fought for him, the fact that they were defeated in the Battle of the Boyne, which has become, you know, a great symbol for the people of the northeast of Ireland. And the second very closely tied in event is also connected with those wars, the Williamite Wars, the war of William of Orange, who succeeded James, the War of William to quell the Jamesian forces in Ireland. James's Irish forces, without the benefit of James, retired to Limerick and very successfully held off the forces of the English. Patrick Sarsfield, a great Irish leader of this Anglo-Irish war, a very romantic person, successfully defended the city of Limerick, signed a treaty with the English after he had surrendered the city, signed a treaty on the treaty stone, or on a stone which you can see the next time you go to Ireland, on this bridge in Limerick. This is reputedly the very stone on which the treaty with the English was signed. The treaty had no sooner been signed than, well, within a day or two, French assistance came up the river, French vessels, but Sarsfield did not break his word. Sarsfield had surrendered, and although with this new force he might have swept completely the English forces in front of him, he kept his word. And he and 11,000 of his soldiers departed from the country according to the terms of that treaty, which gave them that privilege. They would not stay in a conquered Ireland. They went abroad to fight in the Irish brigades on the continent. Hardly, however, had they left the country when the treaty was broken. And that treaty had consequences because wherever the Irish brigade fought on the continent, they were to cry, "Remember the broken Treaty of Limerick." And I have told you in earlier times about the Battle of Fontenoy, in which the Irish brigades participated. And in that battle, the Irish brigade entered with screaming fury, "Remember the Treaty of Limerick. Remember Limerick." The 18th century then opened with the torn pieces of the Battle of Limerick, the torn pieces of the Treaty of Limerick just floating about in the winds, and with the imposition upon the Irish of a very cruel, barbarous code of laws, which are commonly referred to in history as the penal laws. I should like to read you the words of a very calm, rational, scholarly historian who can, in his cold, precise language, sum up these laws much more adequately than any student of Irish affairs might otherwise care to. Professor Lecky, William Lecky, the historian, says of these penal laws of the beginning of the 18th century in Ireland, laws which were not to be repealed until the beginning of the 19th century, he says, the penal laws were intended to make the Irish Catholics poor and to keep them poor, to crush in them every germ of enterprise, and to degrade them into a servile race who could never hope to rise to the level of their oppressors. Nor was he alone in his comment. Another man whose name you will recognize, the great English parliamentarian, Irish-born, but great British parliamentarian Edmund Burke, said these laws were a machine of wise and elaborate contrivance, as well fitted for the oppression, impoverishment, and degradation of a people, and the debasement in them of human nature itself, as ever proceeded from the perverted ingenuity of man. These laws, then, which deprived the Irish of an opportunity for education, which did not allow them to own property, and so on, have great historical significance, far greater than I can take up in this very short talk, great historical significance in the shaping of the Irish character for the next 2 centuries. However, we ought to mention that these are the wretched people for whom Jonathan Swift wrote that masterly, or of whom he wrote that masterly satire, A Modest Proposal. You will perhaps be familiar with it. I can't take it up with you at this moment. These are also the people for whom he spoke out in his Draper letters when he opposed the debasement of the coinage in Ireland, which had been an opportunity by which King George hoped to award his mistress with a fine income. The 18th century saw also the destruction, the systematic destruction by specific legislation, not by generic legislation, but by specific legislation of the British Parliament, the destruction of one Irish industry after another, all through the century. The Irish Catholic then had no position. He was below the level of a slave, and contemporary travelers speak of the wretchedness of his life. He was reduced to a level below that of a slave. But even so, England was not content, and she could not even treat her faithful Protestant garrison, because she had made them Protestant and kept them so as the price of loyalty. I don't mean to impugn the sincerity of their religious motive, but only to indicate how this was tied in very nicely and neatly with politics. It was a divide and conquer. But at the end of the 18th century, or toward the end of the 18th century, the Protestant minority realized it had to protect itself, its own industries, and they were in the control of the Protestant minority. Its own industries, its own livelihood was being swept away. And so, while England was busy with the war of the American Revolution and found herself unable, as it were, properly to garrison Ireland, and particularly to protect her coasts from privateers, the leading Protestants formed what was called the Irish Volunteers. This was extraordinary now. We had an Irish army which within a few years, by 1779 for instance, numbered 40,000. Here you see an illustration of one of these soldiers. And in a few years, these people were to number 80,000. They became so strong that they were able to, their mere presence, the mere fact that the Irish had arms now, was enough to make England heed their demands. And although rebellion was far from their minds, indeed, these were not the old race, these were the Anglo-Irish. Rebellion was not in their minds. And yet they had demands of self-interest, and England listened to them. And in 1783 passed, through the British Act of Parliament, the law which is known as the Act of Renunciation, whereby England promised to forevermore to renounce control over Ireland. And the law said that the right of Ireland to be bound by the laws of its own Parliament is clearly established, shall be and is hereby declared to be established and ascertained forever, and shall at no time hereafter be questioned or questionable. And yet, within a few years, once more a treaty was abrogated, and the Irish were left again with a broken agreement. The Act of Renunciation was soon to be countermanded by an Act of Union abolishing the Dublin Parliament. Yet that Dublin Parliament, in the few years of its existence, while it was not a completely free Parliament, but one which was able to pay attention to home affairs, that Dublin Parliament stimulated the most extraordinary business and economic and even artistic revival. For instance, architecturally speaking, we have examples of some magnificent buildings put up at that time. Here is a contemporary print of the Dublin Custom House, which at that time was one of the most beautiful buildings in Europe, and even today still is a grand edifice. And the Four Courts is another such example of such 18th century architecture. But the 18th century was rushing to a close, and as it rushed to a close, two moves were apparent. One, the attempt of Britain to subvert the Irish Parliament in Dublin. This was accomplished by secret and not so secret means, and in the Act of Union in 1800, this was finally attained. But something else happened. The Parliament, the democratic influences of France stirred the formation in Belfast of a group known as the United Irishmen, whose leader was a Protestant, Wolfe Tone, as indeed the most remarkable thing about this period is that the leadership has to come from the Protestants, and it did. And Wolfe Tone expressed himself in this way: "My purposes are to subvert the tyranny of our execrable government, to break the connection with England." This then was the purpose of Wolfe Tone. In 1798, a rebellion occurred, partially sponsored by very harsh measures of the government. It was suppressed quickly and cruelly. And one of the most interesting things about Ireland is this tendency of the Anglo-Irish at times to become as Irish, if not more Irish, than the Irish themselves. And Lord Edward Fitzgerald was such a man. Here, one of the men who took part in that rising, one of the leaders of it, a descendant of the 12th century Norman invader of Ireland, Lord Edward Fitzgerald. Well, the 18th century comes to a close, and in it, at the close rather, the Act of Union binds the two countries once more together, abolishes the autonomy of the Irish Parliament, and then an abortive rebellion of 1803, led by Robert Emmet, reminds us that all is not dead in Irish nationalism, although things were really in a sorry state. And then finally, with the abolition of that Parliament in 1800, Grattan, a famous parliamentarian and one of the great shapers of that Parliament, said, although the words seemed more like prophecy than anything else, "Yet I do not give up my country. I see her in a swoon, but she is not dead. Though in her tomb she lies helpless and motionless, still on her lips is the spirit of life, and on her cheeks the glow of beauty." It hardly seemed a prophecy.
Ireland Rediscovered is produced by KTCA-TV, Twin Cities Area Educational Television Corporation. The next title in this series is Travail's End. Host and lecturer is Dr. John McKiernan. Ireland Rediscovered is directed by Carl Brookins and produced by Joseph McDermott. This program was presented as a public service by the Patrick Butler Family Foundation.